This WanderLearn episode is brought to you by Sawyer, those guys who make those incredibly good water filters. They have not just made great water filters, but they've actually donated over 1 million of those filters to over 20 countries around the world. And here's the thing that a lot of people don't think about. When you filter water, you're saving trees. You might scratch your head and say, what? What does that mean? Well, think about it. In a lot of low-income countries, they chop down trees to boil water because their water is not potable. It's not healthy or drinkable, so they gotta boil it. I saw it all over Africa. They are chopping down so many trees, and it's especially dangerous around the Sahel, which is the southern part of the Sahara, and we need that tree chopping to stop. And one of the best ways is to hand Africans some filters. Once they realize the power of that and that they don't have to go and lug and cut trees down, that will help change the world and help lower deforestation and improve their lives. Their filters last over 10 years, and they also reduce diarrhea up to 90%. By December 20th, Liberia will be the first low-income country to have clean water from border to border. And that is thanks to Sawyer. So go to Sawyer and check out their products and help them out, because by helping them out, you're helping out other people get clean water as well. So, welcome to the WanderLearn podcast. I'm your host, Francis Tapon. In this episode, it's an Ask Me Anything episode for my patrons, and I'm going to distribute this out there. It's actually one of my patrons, Yida, who asked a bunch of questions, and I figured, well, I'll just make a podcast just for Yida. So, here we go. He wrote,
I was looking through your Nigeria chapter, and I like that you included information about African planned cities. I learned something new, and I didn't know that there are 2 new cities that are multi-billion-dollar cities by Abuja, which is the capital of Nigeria. Urban planning seems to be such a difficult challenge in places like Lagos, which is the biggest city in Nigeria and the biggest city in Africa. So I'm interested in your perspective, he writes. He says, is planning and designing Nigerian cities a futile exercise because the plans get outdated by the time it is implemented due to the rising population and traffic congestion? Were there any particular cities or neighborhoods in Africa you felt safe in or were impressed by? Or perhaps there were cities where you could tell the planners had good intentions and put a lot of effort into it, but it didn't work as planned in reality?
These are all really good questions, Yida, so let me try to answer them. It's not a futile exercise. City planning is an old art and practice that civilizations have done all over the place. And even back in Egyptian times, when you had the pharaohs deciding to put a lot of the necropolises on one side of the Nile, that was kind of a planned thing. There was nothing there at that time, and they decided we're going to make this a necropolis. Also, you see Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp, so was St. Petersburg in Russia. So there is a long history of successful planned cities, and I think the fact that Africa is trying to do that is not unusual, and in fact, Africa has already been successful at making quote-unquote planned cities. One example is Abuja, the capital of Nigeria. What happened was, this is a common theme actually in human civilization, where a country is formed. They have the biggest city is usually on the coast. For example, in this case, it was Lagos. And they said, okay, well, we have this big city on the coast, and we need to, kind of populate the hinterland and maybe put our capital in the center of the country strategically. And that's what they did. Abuja is just that city. There's another example of that happening right now as we speak, which is in Tanzania. Tanzania, the biggest city is Dar es Salaam. And that city is being replaced by a new city built, quote-unquote, artificially. Well, I mean, it already exists there, but it was a tiny little town. And I'm blanking out on the name. It starts with a D, Dodoma. And that is going to be, or in fact, it already is, the capital of Tanzania. And Brazil did this, by the way. Rio de Janeiro was the capital for a long time, and they decided, you know what? We've got all the population of Brazil, practically 90% of it was sitting there on the coast. And we need to kind of do something inland besides Manaus. So they decided Brasilia. and it's a planned city, has like 5 highways. It's a crazy place in some ways to visit. And you might say it was a failed experiment because very few people live there. You got these 5-lane highways that very few people actually use. But one day Brazil will grow into it. And it did have an impact in trying to spread out Brazil's development so that it wasn't only focused on the coast. So I'm not against planned cities. I think it can be a useful thing. I know that also Moscow is doing that. There's been many people that have been trying to do what Silicon Valley did, which is create this kind of tech haven. And in Moscow, they've done that. Some people say successfully, some people not. Dubai, another great example of an artificial quote-unquote city. I mean, 30 years ago, it was just plain desert out in there. And now suddenly you've got, one of the most touristic places in the Middle East. Probably the most touristic place in the Middle East. And it's been a center for all sorts of commerce. So the list of things like that go on. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But Yida is right in the fact that this takes many, many years to plan out. And if you have a fast-growing population, that can make things quite difficult because you have to kind of counter that. And you're trying to catch this thing that's going too fast. So traffic congestion is another issue, the same thing. The only way to solve it is to have some subway system. And in Africa, as far as I can tell, the only sub-Saharan subway system that I remember seeing is in Johannesburg in South Africa. Aside from that, there is no subway system anywhere in the sub-Sahara. And that's because subway systems are really, really expensive. You got to build. And so for them, time in Africa is less valuable than money. And so, or at least it's not worth much. And so a city that puts up with a 2-hour congestion to go from one end of the city to the other, it's not that bad. Versus if that's in Tokyo, 2 hours of congestion, that's just unacceptable for a high-income country like that. So one day, as these African cities continue to get richer, then they will hit that threshold when all of a sudden it makes sense to make subways and do that. So until then, you can expect traffic jams. And by the way, traffic jams are pretty much a thing everywhere in the planet. I mean, I don't think I've ever been to a city that's over 1 million or 2 million people where there is no traffic. It's just kind of the way it goes. It's just people want to live there, and there's only so many things you can move point A from point B. And once you get into the millions of people in a few square kilometers, there's going to be congestion somewhere, either in the subway or over land, or usually both. It'll be interesting to see once we go beyond that, we go into other places like the air, and we start getting congestion and traffic congestion in the air. Some people say we're already there, but frankly, I don't see it until I start seeing the sky filled with flying planes and drones. Then I don't think we're there yet. So he also asked, were there any particular cities and neighborhoods where you felt safe and were impressed by? Well, I felt safe almost everywhere in Africa. And in general, Africa is a supremely safe place, even in the inner city and that kind of stuff. Now, as a white guy, you are a target, and so. But even so, I didn't feel particularly bad. Although I did get mugged in Cameroon. There's places where, for example, I was in Namibia, in Windhoek, which is their capital, and there was a place I went to, a primarily black neighborhood. I mean, you would think that's all black, but there's 5% white in Namibia, and so. It was one of the poorer parts of Windhoek, and the people I met there, they're saying, "Oh no, we have to escort you to go to the shop, otherwise something bad could happen to you." I think they're being a little bit overproductive, but who knows? So I was safe pretty much almost everywhere. But as far as impressed by, I would say definitely the first thing that came to mind was in Rwanda, Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. That really felt like, I call it the Switzerland of Africa. It's a very clean, orderly city, relatively little traffic. It's one of those exceptions. You could say that high density, high population, and yet traffic kind of flows relatively well. No trash on the street, which is uncommon in most of the sub-Sahara. The other one is Abidjan, in the biggest city in Côte d'Ivoire. And by the way, speaking of Côte d'Ivoire, their capital is also a quote-unquote artificial city. The capital of Côte d'Ivoire is Yamoussoukro. Yamoussoukro is the hometown of one of their first presidents. And their first president was this egomaniac. He did a lot of great things for Côte d'Ivoire, and one of the things he did was build the biggest basilica in the world. And there you go. It actually bigger than the Vatican. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And I didn't even know about it until I got there. And I just turned a corner. I saw this enormous basilica. I was like, what? What's this thing doing here? And he tried, really, because it was his hometown and he wanted to become the center. And it was in the center of Côte d'Ivoire, that he wanted to make it to be a rich, fabulous capital. And that is an example of a relatively failed. I say most people would say it failed because Abidjan continues to be really this economic and political center of the country of Côte d'Ivoire. So that's an example of a failed experiment. But I was impressed by Abidjan. It was quite nice. I also really like Dakar in Senegal. Was a nice town to go. I love the gleaming towers of Dar es Salaam. There's like these 3 super great towers. Dar es Salaam is not as bad as I expected it to be. I thought it was going to be really bad. Same thing with Nairobi. Nairobi was actually surprisingly well managed and developed, and paved roads, although they have too many of these dodan in French, but it's speed bumps that are everywhere. That's just ridiculous. Then that's it plagues the entire African continent, are these speed bumps that they put everywhere. And of course, Cape Town, everybody loves Cape Town. And Windhoek, which is the capital of Namibia, is also great. Kinshasa, I thought, was going to be a complete disaster, but it really wasn't. It turned out to be better. And I guess that's a common theme. A lot of African cities I hear about, like, oh, and I just expect like complete disaster. And really, I guess maybe my expectations were so low that it's really not so bad. And then thinking about North Africa, really a gem out there is Algiers, the capital of Algeria. Just a wonderful, wonderful city. Highly recommended. And I did not go to any of the northern cities in Libya. Tunisia, anywhere you go, is pretty clean and great. Then you have Egypt, which is, Cairo is kind of, one of the biggest cities in Africa, and it's chaotic, but, it's okay.
Let's take a 60-second break to thank one of our sponsors, icelab.co. This is the best time to move to the mountain town of your dreams. COVID-19 has changed how the world does business, and many people are now working remotely. So why not live in the mountain paradise you've always dreamed of? The Gunnison Valley in Colorado is that perfect place. Why? Because it's nestled between 4 spectacular mountain ranges. It has 750 miles of biking and hiking, and crested buttes, world-class skiing. And then there's that award-winning school system. It's got it all. Now imagine waking up in your ultimate destination every morning. No traffic, no crowded trails, no more wishing you lived in the mountains. Work where you play in Gunnison Valley. To start living your dream, visit icelab.co. That's icelab.co.
He says,
Are there perhaps cities where you could tell the planners had these good intentions and put in a lot of effort, but it wasn't executed?
I would say Yamoussoukro was probably a good example of that, where they really kind of wanted to plan it out, and they built this huge basilica, and they tried to build up the infrastructure, but it wasn't well executed. So, and that's probably the prime example of that, something that kind of fell short. Okay, he says, as you wrote in a detailed section, you wrote a detailed section about malaria. So I sent out to my patrons the chapter on Nigeria, unedited, 30,000 words. 30,000 words, to put that in perspective, a book can be 30,000 words, a small book. But most books are like 60,000 words, so basically it's almost half a book. And that was just one chapter out of my 54 chapters. And I was like, guys, I need to edit this down dramatically. I'm going to cut 90%. And then some people said, no, don't cut it down 90%. Share with us some of that stuff and let us read it before you throw it on the cutting room floor. And so I did. And he read it, and he noticed that I wrote a lot had a lot of notes about malaria. And he said, I was wondering if you're planning to follow up on discussion about COVID-19 in Africa and some of the major responses and developments. Yeah, COVID-19 in Africa, that's an untold story. People just talk about how African Americans have been plagued by COVID-19, have suffered more than the rest of the United States citizens, other races in America. And they always kind of imply that this is a racist thing, like that almost as if some people are so much like a conspiracy thing, like COVID is designed almost to like hurt the black people of America. And that there's some sort of almost conspiracy against it. I'm like, let's look at the continent that was least affected by COVID, and it's the African continent. It's full of black people. You've got 1.5 billion people there. Well, a billion of them are black, and they're relatively unscathed. And to me, that's a testament of a couple of things. Number one, that COVID really targets old people. And Africa doesn't have that many old people. It's very few people. I mean, there's countries that have life expectancies of about 50. Most Africa is a little bit higher. It's closer in the 60s. But there's some countries in their 50s. And finding a person over their 70s is rare in Africa, in much of Africa. So that, to me, is the biggest reason why Africa has not been that impacted by COVID. The other reason is that Africans spend a lot of times outside because it's warm and they don't have air conditioning. They a lot of times don't have electricity. And so they don't want to spend a whole lot of times indoors. And so as a result, they want to spend all their time outside. It's stuffy, it's hot inside, it's not comfortable. And so even at night, people sleep outside in a lot of places I went to in Africa. And some of them with mosquito nets, others without. But the point is that by being outside, it's another thing to get rid of COVID or to not have so much exposure to it is being outside. A lot of times all the windows are open in offices and that kind of stuff just to have ventilation and flow. These are things I think that are helping the Africans cope with COVID quite a bit. The downside of Africa is that they do like to touch each other a lot. They love to shake hands. It's a kind of a common thing. So I don't know how they're dealing with that. And they are incredibly social people, so that's another downside that they have. But overall, it's showing to me that the biggest predictor about how you're going to be affected with COVID is your age, number one. Maybe how much time you spend outside or not, whether you're getting your vitamin D. And then another issue that people, I guess, don't think about is obesity. And a lot of Africans, they have to move around. They don't own cars, so they take public transportation or they walk a lot, and a lot of the women carry things on their head. Now, obesity is increasing, but in general, it's one of the least, it's a relatively thin continent, certainly compared to Europe and North America. So that's kind of my take on COVID in Africa. And I remember one of my former patrons was kind of feeling terrible because she had to leave Southern Africa. I think she was in Lesotho or something like that. She's like, oh my God, I'm running away from Africa and I feel like I'm abandoning them and it's going to be kind of like a graveyard by the time I come back because everybody's going to die of COVID. And I told her to kind of relax. I think they'll be all right. They've suffered through a lot more terrible tropical diseases before, and I think they'll get through this one. And sure enough, they seem to have. It's too early to tell at this point, but this so far so good. Now, he also says,
who is the intended audience for your book, for The Unseen Africa? Do you see children and educators reading your books? Perhaps some of the geography, social studies, teachers and professors have already read your books and perhaps reached out to you. There is lots of good discussion questions and essay topics that could come out of every chapter. Your book is very educational, filled with facts, geography, history, culture, told in your engaging narrative voice.
Thank you. And he says,
however, the funny adult stories and frank discussions on sex, polygamy, means it would be rated M for mature. Chances are kids working on projects would be unlikely to find this book in their school libraries. I can see teenagers enjoying this, and the book is very readable. I'm curious whether this book would be selected by teachers, school librarians as part of educational resources. He says, I first found The Hidden Europe at a local public library, but not in local bookstores or the university libraries. I can see The Unseen Africa being used as an introduction to Africa, and students can then consult your bibliography for more academic reading.
So thank you, Yida, for all the compliments, and I understand the whole issue. And by the way, I suffered the same thing with The Hidden Europe, because The Hidden Europe, as those who've read it know, there are a few titillating scenes in it. It's probably 1% of the entire book, but because they're so memorable, people make it sound like it's a big portion of the book, like as if a quarter of the book is all about sex, which in fact it's not. Which if I maybe that's my problem. Maybe if I had made a quarter of it as sex, I would have sold a lot more copies. Part of the reason that several people have said it's engaging, it's fun to read, that kind of stuff, part of it is because it's light, and because I do delve into topics that are a bit titillating and exciting and kind of taboo, and that I think really engages people. But obviously because they're not academic, and because some people are, looking at this and saying, oh my God, this is rated M for mature, and maybe that's not good. It's hard to write a book about the unseen Africa and not talk about the unseen sides of Africa. And one of the things that is just not talked about in the media is sex and polygamy and sexual relations and all that kind of stuff. And I think it's something that it doesn't need to be talked about, but I would like to talk about it. My first book, which is called Hike Your Own Hike, 7 Life Lessons from Backpacking Across America, has been used as a textbook repeatedly. And I know that because I get university orders, when they order like 20 copies of the book or 30 copies of the book at a time for their students. So I know it's getting used. The Hidden Europe has not, and I think it could be and should be. And so the same thing with the Africa. But you're right. I'm limiting myself in some ways by not making it more PG or more safe for young people to read. So they're not my target audience. Young children are not my target audience. This is a mature subject that I deal with. I do occasionally swear in the book, things like that. So definitely it's a rated PG-13. How about that? Because teenagers, let's face it, they know a lot more about sex than you and me. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.
And that concludes this episode of the WanderLearn podcast, where we explore travel, technology, and transformation. If you'd like to see the show notes with links to what we talked about, or if you'd like to comment on the show, or if you'd like to ask me a question, then go to WanderLearn.com and click on this episode. If you'd like to connect with me, just remember ftapon. That's my first initial and my last name. ftapon is the username I use on all social media. You can also get to my website by going to ftapon.com. And here's one last reason to remember ftapon. If you like what I do and would like to get rewarded for supporting my projects, then go to patreon.com/ftapon. That's where you can pick up some remarkable rewards for as little as $2 a month. And now for 5 quick favors. Number 1, subscribe to the WanderLearn podcast. 2, download it. 3, share it. 4, review it somewhere. And 5, sign up for my newsletter at WanderLearn.com. Our theme music was composed by Eric Stratman. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.